On the night of May 16th, 1990, around 10:30, paramedics responded to a 911 call from a gated house on Mulholland Drive in the Hollywood Hills. The voice on the line belonged to Marlon Brando. When they arrived, they found a 26-year-old man named Doug Drolet on a couch in the den, shot once in the face. The television was still on. A remote control lay near his hand. In the next room, a 20-year-old woman, 8 months pregnant with the dead man's child, was screaming. The man who had pulled the trigger was her brother. The man who had called the police was her father. And the father, the one kneeling on the floor, trying to breathe life back into the body on the couch, was the most famous actor in America. The Brando name had meant genius, rebellion, untouchable authority for 40 years. The man who played Vito Corleone had built a public image so commanding that the world assumed his private life operated on the same scale. It did not. Behind the name was a family that had been unraveling for decades. 11 children scattered across 2 hemispheres, 3 marriages, a private island purchased as an escape, and a father whose love was enormous, but whose presence was never steady enough to hold any of it together. This is the story of what happened inside the house that Marlon Brando built. Not the one on screen, but the real one. A story that spans 3 decades, 2 continents, a killing, a courtroom confession, and a suicide. A story about 11 children who inherited a famous name and discovered that it came with everything except the one thing they actually needed. To understand what happened inside that house on Mulholland Drive, you have to go back much further than the night itself. You have to go back to the man whose name made the house famous and to the childhood that made the man. Marlon Brando was born on April 3rd, 1924, in Omaha, Nebraska, into a household that looked ordinary from the outside and felt like a siege from within. His mother, Dorothy Pennebaker Brando, was a woman of genuine artistic talent. She acted in local theater, she painted, she carried herself with a kind of luminous sadness that people who knew her remarked upon for years afterward. She was also an alcoholic. Marlon would later recall being a boy who went looking for his mother in bars, who found her slumped and unreachable, who learned early that love and disappearance could live in the same person. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., was a salesman and a disciplinarian, a man whose affection came laced with cruelty, whose approval was either withheld entirely or delivered in ways that felt like punishment. The household was not violent in the way that makes headlines. It was violent in the way that makes children. The boy who grew up inside it learned 2 things that would shape every family he tried to build afterward: that intimacy was the thing he wanted most in the world, and that the people who offered it could not be trusted to stay. That boy became, by any reasonable measure, the most important American actor of the 20th century. He left Omaha, failed out of military school, landed in New York, and found in acting a way to take everything his childhood had given him: the watchfulness, the rage, the hunger for connection, the ability to read a room's emotional weather before anyone else in it had spoken, and turn it into something the world could not look away from. By the time Marlon Brando mattered to the story this script is actually about, the story of his children, his name had already become something larger than a person. He was Stanley Kowalski in A Streetcar Named Desire, the role that announced him to the world in 1951 as a force of physical and emotional truth that American cinema had never encountered. He was Terry Malloy in On the Waterfront, the man who could have been a contender. He was the actor who made audiences believe that performance could be a form of confession so raw it changed what movies were allowed to feel like. And then in 1972, after a decade of career decline and public indifference, he was Vito Corleone in The Godfather, a performance so iconic that even people who had never seen the film knew the voice, the gestures, the image of a patriarch who held an entire world together through will and violence and love. The public Brando was genius, rebellion, animal magnetism, and a level of artistic authority that made him seem immune to ordinary consequence. He refused his Academy Award in 1973, sending Sachin Littlefeather to the stage in his place to protest the treatment of Native Americans. The gesture confirmed what the public already believed. This was a man who operated outside the rules that governed everyone else. There is something about that public image worth sitting with for a moment because it is the scaffolding on which the family tragedy hangs. Brando did not just play a patriarch in The Godfather. He became, in the public imagination, the embodiment of a certain kind of fatherhood, commanding, protective, capable of holding a family together through sheer force of will. The irony is so precise it could be scripted. The man who gave the world Don Corleone was building a private family that looked nothing like the one on screen. No compound, no hierarchy of loyalty, no sons trained to take over. Just a constantly shifting collection of children, lovers, ex wives, and households scattered across two hemispheres, held together by one man's intermittent attention and the gravitational pull of his fame. What the public did not see and what matters now is that Marlon Brando spent his private life trying to build something he had never been shown how to build. He wanted family, he wanted home, he wanted to be the father his own father had failed to be. And he pursued that want the way he pursued everything, with enormous intensity, with bursts of tenderness that the people around him remembered decades later, and with a pattern of abandonment so consistent it became its own kind of cruelty. He married 3 times. He had relationships with women across multiple continents. And he fathered or adopted 11 children: Christian, Miko, Rebecca, Simon Tehotu, Cheyenne, Maimiti, Rayatua, Petra, Ninna, Miles, and Timothy. 11 children spread across different mothers, different households, different countries, different decades. Even one of the most revealing family quotes comes from Christian, the eldest, who later said that he would sit at the breakfast table and wonder who the new people were. The family kept changing shape so often that even the children inside it could not always identify its members. That detail deserves a moment. A boy sitting at a table in a house in Los Angeles, looking at faces he does not recognize, trying to figure out whether they are siblings, half siblings, assistants, girlfriends, or strangers. That is not the childhood of a dynasty. That is the childhood of a system that kept expanding faster than it could cohere, organized around one enormous presence that everyone orbited but no one could hold steady. This was not old money. The Brando fortune was built entirely on a career, on film salaries, back-end deals, and real estate, including the Tahitian atoll of Tetiaroa, which Brando purchased in the 1960s and which became both his refuge and his most enduring symbol of escape. When he died in 2004, probate filings valued his estate at roughly $21.6 million, including $18.6 million in real estate and approximately $3 million in personal property. Those numbers sound large to ordinary people. They are modest by the standards of Hollywood royalty. The Brando wealth was career-made, not inherited, and it rested on the continued earning power and public fascination of one man. When that man's attention wandered, and it wandered constantly, the people who depended on him felt the withdrawal immediately. The children who matter most to this story need to be understood not as names on a family tree, but as people shaped by the specific texture of life inside that orbit. Christian D.V. Brando was born on May 11, 1958, in Los Angeles, the son of Marlon and his first wife, Anna Kashfi. He arrived into one of the ugliest custody battles celebrity culture had yet produced. Kashfi and Brando fought over Christian with a ferocity that treated the child less as a person than as territory. Kashfi's drinking and volatility were cited repeatedly in court filings. Brando eventually won custody, but custody is not the same thing as stability, and Christian never had stability. He bounced between households, between nannies, between schools, between the gravitational pull of a father who could be funny, physical, and deeply loving in one encounter and absent for months in the next. By the time Christian reached adulthood, the pattern was already legible. He was protective, needy, resentful, capable of charm and warmth in flashes, but fundamentally damaged in ways that no one around him seemed equipped to address. He drank. He drifted. He carried a wound shaped exactly like his father's attention. Present sometimes, vanished others, never reliable. Sarita Tiripaya was born on December 30th, 1941 in Bora Bora. She was a French-Polynesian actress, 19 years old when Brando cast her opposite him in Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962. Their relationship gave the Brando story its Tahitian chapter, and that chapter is essential because it represents the version of family life Brando most wanted to believe in. Tahiti was supposed to be the answer. Away from Hollywood, away from the cameras, away from the machinery of American fame, Brando imagined he could build something real. He and Tarita had 2 children together, Simon Tehotu, born in 1963, and Cheyenne, born on February 20th, 1970. But distance from Hollywood did not produce the stability Brando hoped for. The marriage ended. Tarita remained in French Polynesia with the children, and the Tahitian branch of the family grew up knowing their father primarily through visits, phone calls, and the enormous shadow of his name, a shadow that reached them even on an island thousands of miles from Los Angeles. Cheyenne Brando, She is the figure in this story who requires the most care because the public version of her, the beautiful daughter, the Tahitian princess, the tragic girl, flattens a person who was far more complicated than the mythology allows. As a child, she reportedly adored her father. She wanted his attention, his presence, his approval, with an intensity that people who knew the family described as both touching and desperate. As she grew older, that adoration curdled into something sharper. She spoke bitterly about how infrequently Brando visited, how the famous father she idolized kept choosing other places, other people, other versions of family over the one she belonged to. By her late teens, she was beautiful, restless, increasingly unstable, and drawn to the kind of recklessness that fills the space where parental steadiness should have been. Miko Brando, born on February 26, 1961, offers something the rest of this story does not: contrast. He was the son of Brando and his second wife, Movida Castaneda, and his memories of Marlon were warmer than Christian's, less anguished than Cheyenne's. He remembered a father who could wrestle, joke, and make his children feel chosen. Just dad, he would say later, not the legend. Miko spent decades working for Michael Jackson, first as a bodyguard, then as a close associate, and remained connected to the Jackson estate after Jackson's death. In a family story defined by collapse, Miko's survival matters, not because it contradicts the damage, but because it shows that the same father could feel entirely different depending on which child you ask. The household was not one thing. It was a series of private experiences orbiting the same man. Rebecca Brando, born in 1966, the daughter of Marlon and Movita, would become another thread of the family's later life. Her recollections of Brando are human-scaled, funny, specific, stripped of the mythological weight. She remembered him embarrassing her when she brought boyfriends home, offering deadpan warnings that landed somewhere between protective and absurd. Years later, she became one of the family voices involved in the 2015 documentary Listen to Me, Marlon, an attempt to recover her father's complexity from tabloid reduction. But all of that came after. In the years that matter most to this story, Rebecca was one more child in a constellation that kept shifting, held loosely together by a father whose love was real, but whose presence was unreliable. And then there was Dag Drolet. He was not a Brando. He was the son of a prominent French Polynesian political family, a young man from Tahiti, who had known the Brando orbit through the social overlap of the island world. He became Cheyenne's long-term partner and eventually the father of her unborn child. In the story of this family, Dog functions as the outsider who gets pulled into a system he did not build and cannot control. The person who enters through love and finds himself inside a machine whose gears were set in motion decades before he arrived. He loved Cheyenne. He was about to become a father. His family in Tahiti would later say he had wanted distance from the Brandos, that he had sensed something in the family's atmosphere that made him uneasy. Whether that is true or shaped by the grief of what came after, it captures something real. Doug Drolet walked into a household whose internal pressures had been building for decades without knowing it, without having any way of knowing that he was walking into the one room the family would never leave. The best years, if you can call them that, were not so much happy as they were believable. Tetiaroa in the 1970s and 80s was as close as Brando ever came to the life he claimed to want. He had first encountered the atoll while filming Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962, and something about it seized him. The lagoon, the isolation, the idea that a man could buy an island and start over. He secured a long-term lease on Tetiaroa and began building there, slowly, impractically, with the conviction that this was the place where the performance could finally stop. Children visited. Some lived there for stretches. The water was warm, the light was golden, and in certain family photographs from those years you can see what Brando wanted the world to look like. A big man, surrounded by small children on a beach that belonged to him, far from every camera and every obligation and every reminder that he had been built by a country he did not entirely trust. Rebecca and Miko both carried versions of those years forward. Rebecca remembered a father who could be playful in ways that had nothing to do with the legend, a man who, when she brought a boyfriend home for the first time, sat the young man down and told him with perfect deadpan seriousness that there would be no hanky-panky in his house. It was absurd. It was also, in its way, the most ordinary fatherly gesture in a story that has almost none. Miko remembered something similar, a father who could wrestle, joke, make you feel like the only person in the room, who could hold you in a way that made the legend irrelevant. Those memories matter because the loss has to feel like the destruction of something that actually existed, however briefly, however intermittently. If the good was never real, then the tragedy is just inevitability. The tragedy is worse than that. It is the destruction of something that could have been enough. But even in those years, the architecture was wrong. Brando controlled the attention, the money, and the myth. Even when he was physically absent, and he was absent often for months at a time, sometimes on film sets, sometimes on the island, sometimes simply unreachable in ways the children learned not to question. His status organized everyone else's life. The wives, the former wives, the assistants, the children, they all orbited the same star. Affection was real, but so was dependency. The dynamic was not unique to famous families, but fame magnified it beyond recognition. When Brando was present and engaged, the household felt alive, charged, almost magical. When he withdrew into a new relationship, a new cause, a new version of himself, the people who depended on that engagement did not simply miss him. They lost their center of gravity. There was no neutral core in the family to absorb the shock, no stable structure that existed independently of one man's mood, one man's presence, one man's willingness to engage. The children did not have each other in the way that children in a cohesive household have each other. Many of them barely knew their half siblings. Some had met only a handful of times. The family was less a family than a series of bilateral relationships between Brando and each individual child. And when his end of any given relationship went dark, the child on the other end was simply alone. Everything ran through Marlon, and Marlon could not always be reached. The family expanded faster than it cohered. Through the 60s and 70s, more children arrived through different relationships: Miko, Rebecca, Tehotu, Cheyenne, and later Petra, and the children Brando had with Maria Cristina Ruiz. The household, if it could even be called a single household, spread across Los Angeles and Tahiti, across American chaos and Polynesian distance, across a father who believed that movement was a form of freedom, and children who experienced that movement as instability. Brando did not want his children in show business. He was clear about that. But he could not protect them from the effects of being his children. What they inherited was not a craft or a fortune in the dynastic sense. What they inherited was a climate, notoriety, inconsistency, emotional weather that changed without warning. And by the late 1980s, two of those children, Christian and Cheyenne, the eldest son and the Tahitian daughter, were carrying damage heavy enough to pull the whole structure down. And then the weather changed for real. In 1989, Cheyenne Brando was 19 years old and living in Tahiti when she was involved in a serious car accident. The crash was severe. It scarred her face, the face that had been, by every account, one of the most striking things about her, the thing that had given her a brief modeling career and a sense of identity outside her father's shadow. For a young woman whose beauty had been one of the few currencies she felt she owned, the damage was not just physical. It was an erasure of the one thing she had that felt like hers. The depression that followed was not new. People close to Cheyenne said she had been struggling for years, that the hunger for her father's attention had long since curdled into something darker, that drugs and instability had been part of her life before the crash ever happened. But the accident deepened it into something that the family's usual methods could not manage. It took what was already fragile and broke it. Brando's response followed the pattern his children already knew. He moved, he spent. He intervened after the crisis rather than before it. He flew Cheyenne to Los Angeles for reconstructive surgery, arranged the best doctors, deployed the resources that his wealth made available. He could move mountains materially. He always could. What he could not do, what he had never been able to do, was build a stable emotional structure around a daughter who had spent years accumulating damage that no surgeon could reach. The surgery repaired some of what the crash had taken. It did not repair the girl. The period after the crash was marked by erratic behavior, by suicide attempts that would later be cited in court documents, by a young woman whose internal world was collapsing at a speed that alarmed the people closest to her. Cheyenne was 19 years old, then 20. She was beautiful and scarred and angry and desperate for a father who kept arriving after the disaster instead of before it. That pattern, Brando as responder rather than preventer, as rescuer rather than builder, had defined his fatherhood for decades. With Cheyenne, it was about to reach its terminus. Christian's thread needs to be pulled tight here as well. By 1989, he was 31 years old, and his adult life had taken on a shape that would have been recognizable to anyone who understood his childhood. He drank. He drifted between odd jobs and the kind of aimlessness that settles on people whose famous parents gave them access to everything except direction. He had legal trouble. He had relationships that burned hot and collapsed fast. And he carried with him a deep, unresolved need to be the protector, the eldest son, the one who would step in where the father had stepped out. That impulse was not malicious. It was in its way one of the most human things about Christian Brando. He wanted to matter to the family the way his father did. He wanted to be the one who fixed things. The problem was that he was also the one most likely to break them. By early 1990, Cheyenne was pregnant with Doug Drolle's child. The couple had been together for some time, moving in the Tahitian circles where the Brando name and the Drolles name overlapped. Doug was from a prominent French Polynesian political family, a young man who had grown up in a world adjacent to the Brandos without being inside the machinery of their dysfunction. He loved Cheyenne. He was about to become a father, and he had no way of understanding, no frame of reference for what it meant to walk into the interior of a family this damaged. At Marlon Brando's request, Cheyenne and Doug came to Los Angeles, to the house on Mulholland Drive, to await the birth of their child under what Brando apparently imagined would be the shelter of family proximity. It was the kind of decision that sounds reasonable on the surface and reveals its danger only in retrospect. Bring the pregnant daughter home. Bring her partner. Keep everyone close. Christian was already there. He was 31 years old, drinking, volatile, shaped by 3 decades of disorder and resentment, and carrying the particular burden of being the eldest son of a man whose attention he had spent his whole life trying to earn and keep. What Brando had assembled, without seeming to understand the danger of it, was a pressure chamber. A pregnant daughter in crisis, a troubled son with a history of instability, a boyfriend from Tahiti who barely knew Christian and had no way of reading the emotional codes of a family this damaged, and a father who believed that proximity, that simply having everyone under one roof, would be enough to contain what had never been contained. The house on Mulholland Drive sat in the Hollywood Hills like a fortress. The public associated it with movie royalty, with privacy, with the kind of untouchable glamour that ordinary life could never reach. Inside, by the spring of 1990, the reality was a family that had compressed all of its oldest damage into one address. Cheyenne was 8 months pregnant, Doug was in the house, Christian was in the house. And every unresolved wound the family carried, every abandonment, every custody war, every unanswered cry for attention, every year of instability dressed up as freedom, was about to detonate in a single room on a single night in front of the most famous father in America. If you're finding this story as compelling as I do, take a moment to subscribe. There is so much more to this family that the public never saw, and we're just getting started. The collision that was coming on Mulholland Drive did not materialize from nowhere. It had been assembling itself for years, across 2 continents, inside 2 childhoods that bent toward each other like fault lines converging underground. Christian Brando did not become dangerous overnight. The man who walked into that den in May of 1990 had been made slowly and thoroughly by a childhood that offered him everything except the things children actually need. His parents' custody battle was not a disagreement, it was a war. And a cash fee, his mother, was by multiple accounts a woman whose own instability deepened as the marriage dissolved. Her drinking, her erratic behavior, her episodes of violence were cited in court filings throughout the 1960s. Brando fought for custody and eventually won it, but what he won was legal authority over a boy whose early years had already been shaped by chaos. Christian was shuttled between parents who used him as a weapon against each other. He was cared for by nannies who rotated in and out. He changed schools the way other children changed shoes. And through all of it, the one fixed point, the father whose name was on everything, whose face was on movie screens, whose presence meant more to Christian than anything else in the world, kept appearing and disappearing with a rhythm that no child could predict or control. The people who wrote about the Brando family most carefully kept returning to the same observation, that Christian's adult personality was legible as a direct product of that childhood. The protectiveness, the volatility, the drinking, the pattern of inserting himself into situations where he could play the role of defender, all of it traced back to a boy who had learned early that the people he loved were unreliable, that safety was temporary, and that the only way to matter was to act. He was not a violent man by disposition. He was a wounded one, and wounded men, under enough pressure, can become the most dangerous people in a room. Cheyenne's path ran parallel but on different terrain. She grew up in Tahiti, thousands of miles from Christian, raised primarily by Tarita after Brando and Tarita's marriage ended. The distance from Los Angeles was supposed to be protection. Brando framed it that way, and perhaps he believed it. That keeping his Tahitian children far from Hollywood would shield them from the particular damage that American celebrity inflicts on families. From Cheyenne's side, the distance did not feel like protection. It felt like exile. Her father lived in another country, in another world, surrounded by other children and other women, and the visits he made were never frequent enough or long enough to fill the space his absence created. She idealized him as a young girl. She resented him as a teenager. By her late adolescence, the idealization and the resentment had fused into something volatile, a need so intense it could flip into fury without warning. There was a pattern in families organized around a single powerful figure, and it played out in the Brando household with textbook precision. The children who lived closest to the center, Miko, Rebecca, had more access to the warmth, the humor, the physical affection that Brando was capable of when he was present and engaged. The children on the periphery, Cheyenne, Tehotu, and later the children who arrived through still other relationships, received less of that warmth and more of the myth. They knew their father was Marlon Brando. They did not always know their father. The distinction is the one that matters most in this story because it explains why the same man could produce a Miko who remembered his father with genuine tenderness and a Cheyenne who by 20 years old was so damaged by his absence that she had become a danger to herself and everyone around her. The point is not that one child was telling the truth and another was lying. The point is that the same father could feel like play and warmth and acceptance to one child and abandonment, instability, and damage to another. The experience of being Brando's child was not uniform. It depended on which mother you had, which country you grew up in, which decade you were born into, and how much of Brando's attention happened to be available during the years when you needed it most. Christian needed it in the 1960s, when Brando was consumed by custody warfare and career reinvention. Cheyenne needed it in the 1980s, when Brando was aging, increasingly reclusive, and scattered across too many obligations to be reliably present for any single one. Neither child received what they needed when they needed it, and by 1990, both were carrying the accumulated weight of that failure into the same house. The geography made everything worse. The family's life was split between Los Angeles and Tahiti, and that split created a seductive illusion of freedom that was really a mechanism of emotional exile. Children could be moved, problems could be displaced. A crisis in Tahiti could be addressed by flying someone to California. A crisis in California could be absorbed by sending someone back to the island. The motion itself became a substitute for treatment, for therapy, for the slow, patient work of actually repairing the damage that was accumulating inside the family year after year. Brando's wealth made the motion possible. His fame made it feel justified. He was protecting his children from the press, from the public, from the machinery of celebrity. But protection and distance are not the same thing. And the children who were moved the most were often the ones who needed stability the most. By the late 1980s, the family was operating on improvised crisis management rather than anything resembling a stable support system. Therapy appeared in the family's orbit. Brando himself was not hostile to the idea, but it never took the form of sustained structural intervention. No one sat the family down and said these patterns will kill someone if they are not interrupted. No one told Brando that his instinct to gather his troubled children under one roof, while emotionally understandable, was logistically dangerous given the specific combination of personalities involved. The legal system engaged with the family reactively, through custody proceedings, through the occasional arrest, through the machinery that activates after something has already gone wrong. Friends, lawyers, and handlers could manage public fallout. They had been managing it for decades, but no one could reorganize the emotional reality of the household. What Brando's fame and money bought was not protection, it was delay. Problems were absorbed, deferred, renamed, or geographically displaced until they reappeared in more violent form. The family treated crisis the way it treated geography, as something that could be managed by moving, by spending, by rearranging the furniture of a house whose foundation had been cracked from the beginning. Cheyenne's relationship with Dog Drolet had begun in the Tahitian social world where both families moved. Dog was, by the accounts that survive, a quiet man from a respected family. His father was a political figure in French Polynesia, and the Drolet name carried weight in Tahitian society, the way the Brando name carried weight everywhere else. The relationship was serious. Cheyenne became pregnant, And when Brando asked them to come to Los Angeles for the birth, the request carried a weight that neither Cheyenne nor Dag was in a position to refuse. This was not an invitation. It was a summoning issued by a man whose wishes organized the lives of everyone connected to him, even when those wishes were presented as his concern. Dog arrived in Los Angeles only days before the shooting. He had barely spent time with Christian. He did not know the codes of this family, the buried grievances, the way that alcohol and old resentment could turn a conversation into a detonation. He did not know that Christian had spent a lifetime rehearsing for the role of protector without ever learning how to play it safely. He was an outsider in a system that had been pressurizing for decades, and he was placed directly in its center. The sequence of decisions that narrowed the family's options into a single terrible outcome can be laid out plainly. Brando brought Cheyenne and Dag to Los Angeles instead of keeping distance between them and Christian. Christian was allowed to remain emotionally central to the household despite his drinking and volatility. No one intervened to manage the specific combustible dynamic between a protective older brother, a troubled younger sister, and a boyfriend who was about to be accused of something that may or may not have been true. The house became a closed system, and closed systems, when they contain enough pressure, do not slowly decompress. They rupture. On the evening of May 16, 1990, Cheyenne and Christian went to dinner at Musso and Frank Grill on Hollywood Boulevard. The restaurant was an old Hollywood institution, the kind of place where the wood was dark and the booths were deep and the ghost of an earlier industry still lingered in the room. Charlie Chaplin had eaten there. Humphrey Bogart had drunk there. It was a place that carried the weight of Hollywood history in its walls. And the two Brandos who sat down that evening were, in their own way, products of the same industry that had built the restaurant's legend. Shaped by it, damaged by it, unable to escape it even when they tried. It was not a glamorous evening. It was a brother and a sister sitting in a restaurant talking about family. Christian was drinking. Cheyenne was 8 months pregnant, her body heavy with the child she and Dog were about to bring into the world. And at some point during that dinner, across a table in a restaurant where dozens of other people were eating their own meals and living their own lives, Cheyenne told Christian that Dog had been hitting her. The accusation landed in exactly the wrong person at exactly the wrong moment. Christian was drunk. He was already primed by decades of protective impulse and unresolved anger. He was the man who had spent his whole life looking for a role that would make him essential to the family. And here, finally, was that role, the brother who would confront the man hurting his sister. Whether the accusation was true, whether Dag had actually been violent with Cheyenne, is a question that has never been fully resolved. Christian later said he believed Cheyenne that night, believed her completely, believed that the father of her unborn child was hurting her, and felt the protective rage of an older brother who had spent his whole life looking for a role that would make him matter. He also said, later still, that he came to doubt her claims, that he wondered whether Cheyenne, whose instability was by then well documented, had manipulated him into a confrontation that she wanted to happen for reasons he could not fully understand. The prosecution would argue that Christian's actions that night were premeditated. The defense would argue that they were impulsive, chaotic, the product of alcohol and genuine fear for his sister. What is not in dispute is this. After that dinner, Christian and Cheyenne returned to the house on Mulholland Drive. Christian was drunk. He was armed. And Doc Drolle was in the den. The details of what happened inside the house between approximately 10:30 and 11 o'clock that night exist in two versions that have never been reconciled. Christian's version was this. He confronted Dag about the abuse. He brought the gun to intimidate, not to kill. There was a struggle on the couch. The gun went off accidentally. He never intended to shoot anyone. In this version, the killing was a catastrophic accident inside a confrontation that was meant to be protective. A brother defending a sister, a weapon that discharged in a moment of physical chaos, a death that no one in the room intended or wanted. The police version was different, and it was the version that the physical evidence supported. Officers who arrived at the scene found Doc Drolle on the couch in the den, shot once in the left side of the face. There was a television remote near his body. The television was still on. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken objects, no defensive marks on Dag's hands or arms, no physical evidence of the kind of violent confrontation that Christian described. The positioning suggested that Dag had been seated, possibly watching television, relaxed or at least unaware of imminent danger when the shot was fired. The gun had not gone off in a wrestling match. It had gone off in a room where one man was sitting down and another was standing with a weapon. There was also the question of the gun itself. Christian had brought a 45 caliber handgun with him when he returned from dinner. He had carried it into the house, carried it through the rooms, carried it into the den where Dog sat. The act of bringing a loaded weapon into a confrontation is not the act of a man who intends only to talk. It is the act of a man who has already decided that words will not be enough. Whether Christian understood that distinction in the moment, whether the alcohol and the rage and the decades of accumulated damage had narrowed his thinking to the point where bringing a gun felt like bringing leverage rather than bringing death, is the question the legal system would spend the next year trying to answer. That contradiction, accidental discharge versus deliberate shot, became the legal and moral fault line of everything that followed. The story should not resolve it because it has never been resolved. What it should do is hold both versions in the same frame and let the understanding settle that the truth, whatever it was, emerged from a family system in which both stories were plausible. Christian was exactly the kind of man who might bring a gun to a confrontation he could not handle without one. He was also exactly the kind of man who might, in a moment of drunken rage and misplaced protective fury, shoot a man on a couch and then convince himself it was an accident. The family had produced both possibilities. The family had made both outcomes available. Marlon Brando's 911 call came in around 10:30 that evening. What the dispatchers heard on the other end of the line was one of the most recognizable voices in the world. The voice of Don Corleone, of Stanley Kowalski, of Terry Malloy, saying that someone had been shot in his house. The police and paramedics who responded found the Mulholland Drive property in a state of controlled chaos. Other family members were in the house. Cheyenne was there. The scene was secured. Christian did not flee. By the time paramedics arrived, Doc Drolet was dying. Brando, by multiple accounts, had attempted to revive him, had tried CPR, had put his mouth over the mouth of a 26-year-old man who was bleeding out on his couch, had done the desperate, futile things that people do when the reality of what has happened has not yet fully arrived. He was no longer an icon in that moment. He was a 66-year-old father in a house he could not control, trying to breathe life back into a man his son had just shot. The paramedics took over. The police took over, and the house on Mulholland Drive, the fortress, the retreat, the place that had symbolized celebrity privacy and untouchable glamour, became a crime scene. The image is devastating precisely because of its smallness. The most famous actor in America, on his knees, failing to save a life, in a room that smelled like gunpowder and looked like the end of something that could never be rebuilt. Christian was arrested that night. The charge was murder. Elsewhere in the house, Cheyenne was in a state that witnesses later described as hysterical. She was 8 months pregnant. The father of her child had just been shot by her brother. The accusation that had set the evening in motion, "Dag hit me," was now attached to a body on a couch and a brother in handcuffs. Whatever she had intended by telling Christian, whatever she had imagined would happen, the reality was a magnitude beyond anything intention could contain. What followed was not a private family crisis. It was a public spectacle of the kind that only America produces, and only around its most famous families. Reporters descended on Mulholland Drive within hours. Camera crews staked out the courthouse. Tabloid helicopters circled the property. The story had every ingredient the American media machine required. A famous patriarch, a beautiful daughter, a dead outsider, a troubled son with a gun, a contested version of events, and the sense that a dynasty was being stripped bare in front of the entire country. Before the O.J. Simpson trial would consume American media 4 years later, the Brando case had already established the template: celebrity, violence, a family whose private dysfunction became a national narrative, and a courtroom where the question was not just what had happened in a room, but what had gone wrong in a lineage. The tabloid press called it the curse of the Brandos. The serious press treated it as a study in the limits of fame's insulation. Both were reaching for the same thing: the recognition that this family, for all its wealth and all its legend, had failed at the one thing that all families are supposed to do, which is keep its members alive. Each member of the family entered a separate version of the aftermath, and none of those versions converge. Christian moved from the role of defender to the role of defendant in the span of a single night. The man who had gone to dinner believing he was protecting his sister woke up in a cell, charged with killing her partner. His entire identity, the protector, the eldest son, the one who was supposed to fix things, had been weaponized by a family system that had given him the impulse to act without giving him the judgment to act wisely. Cheyenne became simultaneously bereaved, pregnant, psychologically unstable, and legally central to a case she was in no condition to manage. She was the key witness. She was the person who had made the accusation that sent Christian into that room. She was also a young woman in the 8th month of a pregnancy, carrying the child of the man who had just been killed in her father's house. The prosecution needed her testimony. They would not get it. Marlon Brando became something he had never been in public before, a father pleading for mercy. During the proceedings, he took the stand, and what followed was one of the most extraordinary moments in American courtroom history, not because of any legal argument, but because of who was speaking and what he was finally willing to say. He wept. The man who had spent 40 years mastering the art of controlled emotion, who could calibrate a performance to the exact degree of intensity a scene required, broke down in a way that no one in that courtroom believed was performance. He talked about Christian's childhood. He talked about the custody battle, about the instability, about the failures that had accumulated across decades. And then he said the line that punctured the public myth with the precision of a single sentence. He told the court that he believed he had failed as a father. That sentence, "Perhaps I failed as a father," was not a performance. It was a confession delivered to a room full of strangers, cameras, and the weight of everything the family had been unable to contain. The most powerful actor of his generation, the man who had built a career on the ability to inhabit other people's pain, was now standing in a courtroom inhabited by his own. The public had spent decades watching Marlon Brando become other people. Now they watched him become himself, and what they saw was a man who understood, too late, that the family he had built was a structure designed to produce exactly the catastrophe it had produced. Tarita and the Tahitian branch of the family were pulled into an American legal spectacle they had no ability to manage and no preparation to withstand. Dog's family wanted justice. They wanted accountability for a son who had been killed in someone else's house, in someone else's country, inside someone else's family dysfunction. Cheyenne's family wanted survival, wanted to hold together whatever could still be held, wanted to shield a pregnant, psychologically unstable young woman from a legal system that needed her testimony and a media machine that wanted her story. The two desires were irreconcilable, and the collision between them would play out across courts, across countries, and across years that none of them would ever fully recover from. Doug Drolet was dead. He was 26 years old. He had come to Los Angeles from Tahiti to be near the woman carrying his child, and he had been killed in her father's house by her brother, on a couch, in a room where the television may still have been on when the shot was fired. His son would be born 6 weeks later into a family that had just destroyed itself. The child would carry the name Tuki. He would carry his father's absence for the rest of his life. Christian was in custody, facing a murder charge that would eventually be reduced but never disappear. Cheyenne was unraveling, her pregnancy advancing toward delivery, while her mental state deteriorated in ways that would soon make her legally unreachable. Marlon Brando had been pulled out of mythology and into fatherhood in the most public and catastrophic way imaginable. And the aftermath, the long, grinding, merciless aftermath that would claim more from this family than the shooting itself, had not yet begun. The aftermath began with disappearance. Within weeks of the shooting, Cheyenne Brando returned to Tahiti. She was still pregnant, she was psychologically shattered, and she was, in the eyes of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, the single most important witness in the case against her brother. Without Cheyenne's testimony, without her account of the abuse accusation, without her version of what she told Christian and why, without her presence in an American courtroom where a jury could see her face and hear her voice and decide for themselves whether the killing had been planned or impulsive, the prosecution's ability to sustain a first-degree murder charge depended on physical evidence and inference alone, and Cheyenne was gone. She gave birth to her son on June 26, 1990, 6 weeks after Doug Drolet was killed. The child was named Tuki. He arrived into a world that had been organized before his birth around the expectation of two parents, a famous grandfather, and the kind of complicated but survivable family life that the Brandos had been improvising for decades. Instead, he arrived into ruins. His father was dead, his mother was unraveling, his uncle was in jail, and his grandfather, and the man whose name defined the family, whose gravitational pull had drawn everyone to the house where the killing happened, was now a figure of public pity rather than public awe. The legal proceedings ground forward with the particular cruelty of systems that do not pause for grief. Prosecutors attempted to compel Cheyenne's testimony. She was in Tahiti, beyond the easy reach of American subpoenas, and her mental state was deteriorating in ways that made her legally unreachable, even if she could have been physically retrieved. She was hospitalized. She attempted suicide. A French court eventually ruled her psychologically unfit to testify, a determination that effectively gutted the prosecution's case. Without Cheyenne on the stand, the state could not prove that Christian had entered that room with premeditated intent to kill. The physical evidence suggested deliberation. The missing witness made deliberation unprovable. In January of 1991, Christian Brando pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. The plea was a negotiation, a reduction from the murder charge that reflected the prosecution's weakened position without Cheyenne's testimony. It was also, in its way, a confession that stopped short of the full truth. Voluntary manslaughter acknowledged that Christian had killed Doug Drolet. It did not resolve whether the killing was accidental, impulsive, or planned. That ambiguity would follow the family for the rest of their lives. Christian was sentenced to 10 years in prison. He would serve approximately 5. The sentence was shaped in part by Marlon Brando's courtroom testimony, the broken plea of a father who acknowledged his own failures, and in part by the defense's argument that Christian's entire life had been a series of institutional and parental failures that had made the catastrophe on Mulholland Drive, if not inevitable, then at least comprehensible. The court accepted the argument. The Drolet family did not. For Doug's family, the sentence was an insult and a confirmation of what they had feared from the moment the case entered an American courtroom saturated by celebrity. A famous family, they believed, had bought a reduced consequence for a killing that the physical evidence, the seated victim, the absence of a struggle, the deliberate act of bringing a loaded gun into a room, suggested was something far worse than voluntary manslaughter. Jacques Drolet, Doug's father, was a political figure in French Polynesia, a man accustomed to institutions that functioned on principle rather than fame. The American legal system, as he experienced it, had weighed the Brando name on the scale and adjusted the outcome accordingly. That perception, whether entirely fair or not, never left the Drolet family. They pursued civil action. They made public statements. They carried Doug's death as an unanswered demand for justice that the criminal proceedings had failed to deliver. And their grief existed alongside the Brando family's own grief in a way that made reconciliation impossible, because the two families could not even agree on what had happened in the room where Doug died, much less on what the consequence should have been. The Drolet family's pain is one of the threads in this story that resists tidy resolution. Doug was not a supporting character. He was a 26-year-old man with a family, a future, and a child he never held. The Brando narrative, because it is organized around a famous patriarch and his famous children, risk absorbing Doug into the machinery of someone else's tragedy. The corrective is simple and important. Doug Drolet's death mattered on its own terms. He was not killed by a dynasty. He was killed by a man in a room with a gun. The dynasty is the context. The killing is the fact. For Marlon Brando, the years after the shooting were the years in which the private damage became permanent. Later accounts from people who knew him described a man who seemed broken in a way that his earlier difficulties, the career struggles, the failed marriages, the weight gain and reclusiveness, had not broken him. The Christian and Cheyenne catastrophe was different. It was not a career setback or a romantic failure. It was the confirmation of the thing he had feared most and tried hardest to prevent, that his family, the thing he had wanted most to build well, had been built on foundations so unstable that they could produce a killing. He had told the court he had failed as a father. Now he had to live with the truth of that sentence every day, in a house that was also a crime scene, in a life that was now defined not by The Godfather or on the waterfront, but by a 911 call and a dead man on his couch. In 1994, Brando published his autobiography, Songs My Mother Taught Me. The book was revealing about his childhood, his acting philosophy, and his views on race, politics, and Hollywood. It was notably silent about his wives and largely silent about his children. The omission was not accidental. It was the final act of a man who had spent his life trying to control which version of himself the public was allowed to see. Even in confession, Brando edited, even in a book titled after his mother, he could not bring himself to write honestly about the family he had made. The gap between the public confession in the courtroom and the private evasion in the memoir tells you everything about how he processed what had happened. He could admit failure in a moment of extremity, but he could not sit with it long enough to put it on a page. Cheyenne's path after the trial is the true second tragedy of this story, and it deserves to be told as its own breaking point rather than a footnote to the shooting. After returning to Tahiti with Tuki, her life did not stabilize, it continued to deteriorate. The depression that had followed the 1989 car crash had been deepened immeasurably by the killing, by the knowledge that her accusation had set the evening in motion, by the loss of Dag, by the birth of a child she was in no condition to raise, by the relentless attention of a press that treated her as a character in someone else's story rather than a person living through her own destruction. She was hospitalized repeatedly. She attempted suicide more than once. Tuki was cared for increasingly by Tarita, the grandmother, because Cheyenne could not reliably care for herself. The 5 years between the shooting and her death were not a gradual decline so much as a series of crises separated by intervals of fragile stability that never held. She would seem better. She would seem to be finding ground. And then the ground would give way again. Another hospitalization, another attempt, another confirmation that the damage was deeper than any available treatment could reach. The courts and the medical systems that engaged with or treated the symptoms, the immediate crises, the acute episodes, but could not address the underlying architecture of harm that had been building since childhood. She was Marlon Brando's daughter. She was beautiful and broken and famous for being broken, and no institution she encountered in Tahiti or in France was equipped to save her from the combination of inherited dysfunction, personal trauma, and public exposure that was killing her by degrees. There is something about Cheyenne's story that requires care in the telling, because the temptation is to treat her death as the inevitable conclusion of a trajectory that began with the shooting. It was not inevitable. People survive worse. People survive childhood neglect and car accidents and the violent death of a partner and depression and public scrutiny and still find a way to remain alive. Cheyenne did not find that way. That is not a failure of character. It is the result of a specific set of circumstances and a specific family, a specific level of damage, a specific absence of the sustained support that might have made the difference, that converged on one woman and did not relent. In April of 1995, at her mother Tarita's home in Punauia, Tahiti, Cheyenne Brando took her own life. She was 25 years old. That sentence needs to sit for a moment. 25. She had lived through a car crash that scarred her face, a pregnancy shadowed by violence, the killing of her child's father by her own brother, a legal system that treated her as a witness rather than a victim, and 5 years of depression so severe that the people around her had been watching her approach this end long before she reached it. The reporting that followed her death tied it directly to that 5-year trajectory, to the crash, to the shooting, to the accumulated weight of a life that had never been given the support it required. She was buried in Tahiti, far from the house where the killing happened, far from the father whose attention she had spent her life trying to earn, far from the brother whose act of protection had destroyed the person he was trying to protect, Etsna. Tuki was 4 years old when his mother died. He had already lost his father before he was born. Now he lost his mother before childhood was over. He would be raised in Tahiti by his grandmother, Tarita Tiripaya, the woman whose home had become the site of her daughter's death. That detail, a grandmother raising the child of a daughter who ended her life in the grandmother's house, is the kind of fact that resists narrative shaping. It is too heavy for metaphor. It simply is. Christian Brando was released from prison after serving approximately 4.5 to 5 years of his 10-year sentence. Freedom did not rebuild him. The years after prison were marked by more legal trouble, substance abuse, and domestic violence charges that tracked through public records like a continuation of the same pattern that had produced the shooting. He lived in the shadow of the killing the way his father had lived in the shadow of the roles that made him famous, unable to be seen as anything else, unable to start a story that did not begin with what he had done. On May 16th, 1990, he was not the same man who had gone in, but he was not a different one either. The protective impulse was still there. The volatility was still there. The drinking was still there. What was gone was whatever possibility had existed, however slim, that Christian Brando might build a life that was not defined by the worst thing he had ever done. The prison sentence, in the end, was only one formal punishment inside a much longer collapse. A collapse that had begun in a childhood defined by custody wars and emotional chaos, and that continued after the killing, through decades of diminishment that no one outside the family paid much attention to. Christian Brando died of pneumonia in January of 2008. He was 49 years old. The obituaries mentioned the shooting. They all mentioned the shooting. It was the thing that defined him in public, the way his father's performances defined Marlon. Neither man ever escaped the role the world assigned him. Christian had spent his life trying to be the protector, the fixer, the son who mattered. In the end, the only role the public remembered was the one he played on a single night in his father's den. Marlon Brando died on July the 1st, 2004, at the age of 80. He had spent his final years in increasing seclusion, his body heavy, his health failing, his public appearances rare and often difficult to watch. The man who had once been the most physically magnetic actor in American cinema became, in his last decade, a recluse on Mulholland Drive. The same house, the same address, the same rooms where the killing had happened 14 years earlier. He did not move. He stayed in the house where Doug Drolet died, in the house where he had called 911, in the house where the gap between his public image and his private reality had been exposed in the most violent way possible. Whether he stayed out of attachment, inertia, or some need to remain in proximity to the worst thing his family had done, no one outside his inner circle could say with certainty. The last decade of his life was lived in the aftermath of the catastrophe. After Christian's imprisonment, after Cheyenne's death, after the tabloid narrative had hardened into the version the public would carry forward, the great actor whose family was destroyed by the same forces he could not control off-screen. When his estate entered probate, the filings confirmed what those close to him already knew. The fortune was real but not vast, $21.6 million, most of it in real estate, a fraction of what the public imagined a man of his stature would leave behind. 11 children had claims on that estate, 11 people who had known 11 different versions of the same father. The legal proceedings that followed were another version of the same family pattern. Competing interests, competing needs, competing memories of a man who had meant something different to each person who survived him. And then there was Tetiaroa, the island that Brando had purchased as a refuge, the place where he had tried to build a life outside performance, became in death one of the family's most enduring and most ironic legacies. In 2009, the Brando Family Trust approved the development of a luxury resort on the atoll. It opened as the Brando, a high-end eco-resort that marketed itself on conservation, sustainability, and the romance of a private island once owned by the greatest actor of his generation. The place he had fled to for peace became a destination. The place where he had tried to escape the machinery of fame became a product of it. Guests paid thousands of dollars a night to sleep on the island where Marlon Brando had once imagined his children could grow up free from the weight of his name. The irony does not need commentary. It speaks for itself. The closest thing to a canonical telling of the family's private story came not from journalism or from court records, but from Brando himself, recorded in private and released after his death. The 2015 documentary Listen to Me, Marlon, built from hundreds of hours of audio that Brando had recorded over decades, private reflections, self-analysis, confessions spoken into a tape recorder in rooms where no one else was listening, offered something that the autobiography had refused to provide: the sound of a man trying to understand what he had done and what it had cost. The documentary was made with family cooperation. Rebecca Brando was involved in its production, and her willingness to allow her father's most unguarded moments to be heard by the public was itself a kind of statement, an acknowledgement that the tabloid version of the family had become so dominant that only Brando's own voice, in all its contradiction and pain, could complicate it. The film did not resolve the family's story or explain away the killing or the suicide or the decades of dysfunction. What it did was recover Brando's complexity from the tabloid reduction that had consumed it. The idea that his family was simply cursed, simply doomed, simply the wreckage left behind by a great man's selfishness. The truth, as the tapes revealed, was harder than that. Brando knew what he was doing wrong. He knew he was failing. He spoke about his children with a tenderness that coexisted with his inability to be present for them consistently. He analyzed his own patterns with a clarity that made his failure to change those patterns even more painful to hear. He said so, on tape, in a voice that sounded nothing like any character he had ever played. He just could not stop. There is no major dramatization devoted specifically to the tragedy of the 11 children. The family's story exists in public memory through the trial coverage, the tabloid archive, and those private tapes, a record that is extensive enough to be devastating and incomplete enough to leave the central questions permanently open. What remains of the Brando family now is fractured continuity rather than a single public unit. Miko Brando, born in 1961, spent decades in Michael Jackson's inner circle, first as a bodyguard, then as a close personal associate, then as a man who understood celebrity proximity from the inside because he had grown up immersed in it. He remained connected to the Jackson estate after Jackson's death in 2009, and his professional life has been defined less by the Brando name than by the Jackson one. He is one of the more visible surviving children, though he lives mostly outside the kind of celebrity storytelling that defined his father's life. Of all the children, Miko may be the one who best understood that the Brando name was something to carry quietly rather than perform. Rebecca Brando, born in 1966, has served at times as a public voice for the family legacy, particularly around Listen to Me, Marlon, and has been publicly involved in conservation work connected to Tahiti. Her engagement with the family's story has been deliberate and careful, not a bid for celebrity, but an attempt to ensure that her father's complexity and the family's is not reduced to tabloid shorthand. Petra Brando Fisher, born in 1972, lives in London and has been publicly linked to the Brando Fisher Foundation. Each of them carries the name differently: Miko with quiet distance, Rebecca with active engagement, Petra with a life built deliberately far from Hollywood. The variety itself tells you something about the family. 11 children, and no two of them arrived at the same relationship with the name they shared. The Tahitian branch of the family remains important even where the public record is thin. Tarita Teripaya, born in 1941, is the surviving matriarch of the line that produced Cheyenne and Tehotu. Current public reporting on her daily life is limited, but her role in the story is permanent. She is the mother who outlived her daughter, the grandmother who raised her grandson, the woman whose home became the place where the family's second tragedy ended. Tehotu, Maimiti, and Raiatua have lived largely private lives, appearing in mainstream reporting only intermittently and usually in connection with Tetiaroa, or the broader Brando legacy. Nina, Miles, and Timothy, the children Brando had, with Maria Cristina Ruiz, are adults now, but reliable public reporting about their current lives is sparse. The honest thing to say is that they have chosen or been given the privacy that the family's most visible members were never allowed. And then there is Tuki. Tuki Brando, the son of Cheyenne and Dog, the child born 6 weeks after his father was killed and orphaned of his mother before he turned 5. He grew up in Tahiti, raised by Tarita, carrying a name that meant tragedy to everyone who heard it and something more private and more complicated to the boy who lived inside it. He became a model, his face carrying the beauty of both his parents, the Polynesian warmth of his mother, and the fine features of his father. And in that work, he became the next generation's most visible carrier of the Brando name. He did not choose the legacy. It was placed on him before he could speak, shaped by events he had no part in, defined by a night he was not yet born to witness. He is not one of the 11 children. He is what came after, and his existence is the clearest expression of the dynasty thesis that runs beneath this entire story, that the adults make the decisions and the children absorb the cost, and the cost is always deferred to the next generation and the next and the next. What this family's story finally reveals is not that fame corrupts or that wealth is meaningless. It is something harder and less tidy than either of those lessons. Marlon Brando built one of the most admired public identities in American culture and still could not give all of his children the things that children actually need to survive: steadiness, clarity, containment, a home that did not keep changing shape. The money insulated them from ordinary hardship. It did not protect them from inherited damage, emotional chaos, addiction, depression, or violence. The man who spent years trying to escape to an island he called paradise could not outrun the patterns he carried with him. And the children, the 11 children who bore his name and lived inside the weather of his attention, paid for that failure in ways that no fortune, no fame, and no amount of late arriving love could repair.